In a world where the past can haunt us and the future fills us with fear, how do we find peace in the present? It was a day like any other in the rolling hills of Galilee. The warm breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the sky above was a canvas of vibrant blue, with the occasional wisp of cloud. Jesus, ever the teacher and guide, had gathered his disciples for what seemed like a routine journey, but there was an unusual sense of purpose in his steps. As they walked, the disciples whispered quietly among themselves, speculating where the Master was leading them this time. They had traveled together for so long, sharing meals, miracles, and stories. Yet every moment with Jesus felt new, filled with deeper mysteries and revelations. Today they sensed would be no different. The path before them wound through hills and valleys, through olive groves and past golden fields of wheat. With every step, they noticed something in Jesus' demeanor. His eyes seemed to be focused on something distant, something beyond the landscape before them. It was as though he could see into a realm they could not yet understand. His silence, usually so filled with quiet assurance, felt heavier today, as if a great truth was about to be revealed. Andrew, walking near the front, turned to his brother Peter and whispered, "What do you think he is going to show us today?" Peter, his brow furrowed in concentration, simply shook his head. "I don't know, but there's something different about this walk. I feel it in my bones." As they continued, the chatter among the disciples quieted, their steps becoming slower, more deliberate. There was something in the air, an anticipation, a sense that they were approaching not just a physical destination but a spiritual one. After what felt like hours, they came to a clearing, and before them lay a river. It was unlike any river they had ever seen. The water shimmered in the afternoon light, but it did not behave as rivers usually do. It flowed in two directions at once. On one side, the water ran downstream as expected, but on the other, it flowed backward, defying the natural order. The disciples stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening at the sight. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle, mesmerizing flow of the water. The river's dual currents seemed to reflect something deeper, something beyond the physical world. Peter, always the first to speak, broke the silence. "Rabbi, what kind of river is this? How can it flow in two directions?" Jesus, his face calm and full of an almost otherworldly understanding, turned to face them. "This river," he said softly, "holds the key to understanding time. Just as the water flows both forward and backward, so too does time. I have brought you here to learn something vital, something that will free your hearts." The disciples, though often confused by Jesus' parables, trusted him implicitly. They nodded, though unsure of what he meant, and waited for him to continue. Jesus motioned for them to sit by the riverbank, and as they settled on the soft grass, the sound of the river's flowing water filled the air. It was soothing yet strange, like a lullaby from another world. After a moment of silence, Jesus began to speak, his voice gentle but filled with authority. "There was once a man," he said, "who lived his life in the shadow of regret. His heart was weighed down by the mistakes he had made, the wrongs he could not undo. Each day he would sit by a river much like this one and weep." The disciples leaned in closer. Jesus' stories always seemed simple at first, but they knew there was always a deeper meaning. This time was no different. As they listened, they each began to think of their own lives, their own mistakes, their own regrets. "The man," Jesus continued, "would sit on the banks of the river, watching the water flow away from him, much like his life had flowed away in the wrong direction. 'My sins,' he thought, 'are like this water. They have passed and I cannot bring them back. I cannot change what I have done, and so I am doomed to live in regret.'" Peter, sitting nearest to Jesus, felt his heart tighten. He knew what it was like to live with regret. He thought back to the night he had denied Jesus. 3 times he had sworn that he did not know the man. Even though Jesus had forgiven him, Peter still carried the weight of that night. The memory haunted him in quiet moments, whispering that he was unworthy, that he had failed. James and John too felt the sting of the story. They remembered their pride, the time they had asked to sit at Jesus' right and left hand in his kingdom. Their ambition had caused division among the disciples, and even though Jesus had gently corrected them, the memory still brought them shame. Jesus continued the story, his voice soft but filled with the weight of truth. The man's heart grew heavier with each passing day. He could not let go of his past, and it poisoned his present. Every morning he would come to the river, sit on the banks and watch the water flow away, believing that his life too had flowed away beyond redemption. The disciples sat in silence, the weight of the story settling over them like a heavy cloak. Each of them had their own regrets, their own burdens. They understood the man's pain all too well. Jesus' voice softened as he spoke of the man's encounter with a stranger. One day as the man sat by the river, a stranger appeared. The stranger looked at the man with kindness in his eyes and asked, "Why do you sit here in sorrow?" The man explained that his past was filled with mistakes, and that he could not forgive himself. "I watch this river flow," the man said, "and I see my life flowing away out of my control, beyond my reach. I wish I could go back and change things, but I cannot." The disciples hung on Jesus' every word, their hearts aching with recognition. They too had sat by the rivers of their own regrets, wishing they could turn back time, undo their mistakes and make different choices. But time, like water, flows in one direction, away from us. Jesus paused, letting the tension build before continuing. The stranger listened patiently and then spoke words that changed the man's life. "You are looking at the wrong part of the river," he said. "You are watching the water that has already flowed past you, the water you cannot touch. But look here." The stranger pointed to the ground where the man sat. "This is where the water touches you now. This is the present moment, and it is the only part of the river you can touch. The past has flowed away, and the future has not yet arrived. But here in this moment is where you live. Here is where you can be free." The disciples were silent, the weight of the stranger's words hanging in the air. They had never thought of life this way before. They had always been so caught up in their past failures or their worries about the future that they had forgotten the power of the present moment. Jesus looked at each of his disciples with love in his eyes. He knew the burdens they carried. He knew the weight of Peter's denial, the ambition of James and John, the doubts of Thomas. He knew their hearts, and he longed to free them from the chains of their past and the fears of their future. As Jesus spoke, the disciples felt their own memories stirring. The story of the man at the river was not just a story, it was their story. They too had sat by rivers of regret, longing to undo the mistakes they had made. Peter's heart was heavy as he thought back to that fateful night. He had been so sure of his loyalty to Jesus, so certain that he would never deny him. And yet, when the moment came, fear had overtaken him, and he had denied his Lord. The memory still haunted him, even after Jesus had forgiven him. He couldn't help but wonder, how could he ever be worthy to lead the others when he had failed so miserably? John, the beloved disciple, thought of his own pride. He had always been close to Jesus, always felt a special bond with him. But there had been times when his pride had gotten in the way. He remembered the day he and his brother James had asked Jesus for a place of honor in his kingdom. It had caused division among the disciples, and even though Jesus had forgiven them, the memory still brought him shame. And then there was Thomas. Thomas had always been the skeptic, the one who needed proof. Even after Jesus' resurrection, he had doubted. He had needed to see the wounds, to touch the scars before he could believe. That doubt had left a mark on him, a deep fear that he would always be the one who needed more faith, the one who struggled to believe. As Jesus spoke of the man at the river, the disciples felt the weight of their own pasts pressing down on them. They understood the man's sorrow because they had lived it. They had carried their mistakes, their failures, their regrets like heavy stones in their hearts. But it wasn't just the past that weighed on the disciples, it was also the future. They had followed Jesus for years, but the path ahead was uncertain. They didn't know what was coming, and that uncertainty filled them with fear. Peter worried about his role in the future. Jesus had told him that he would be the rock upon which the church would be built, but how could he be that rock when he had failed so deeply? What if he failed again? What if he wasn't strong enough? James and John, once so eager to sit at Jesus' right and left hand in his kingdom, now felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on them. They had been ambitious, but now they realized that leadership would come with great sacrifice. Could they really live up to the calling that Jesus had placed on their lives? And Thomas feared that his doubts would follow him into the future. He had always struggled with faith, always needed proof. What if he couldn't believe enough? What if his doubts kept him from fulfilling the mission Jesus had given them? The future loomed before them like a great unknown, a vast ocean of possibilities, both good and bad. And that uncertainty filled them with fear. As the disciples sat by the river, lost in their thoughts, Jesus' voice brought them back to the present. "The past is like this water," he said, gesturing to the part of the river that flowed downstream. "It has already flowed and you cannot bring it back. The future is like the water that flows upstream. It has not yet arrived and you cannot control it. But here in this moment," he pointed to the water at their feet, "is where you live. This is where grace flows." The disciples looked at the water, the sound of the river filling their ears. It was a strange, almost hypnotic sound, the two currents flowing together yet in opposite directions. As they watched, they began to understand what Jesus was saying. The past could not be changed. The future could not be predicted. But the present, this moment, right now, was where life happened. This was where they could find peace, forgiveness, and grace. Jesus stood and motioned for them to come closer to the water's edge. One by one they knelt beside him, dipping their hands into the cool, flowing river. The water felt refreshing against their skin, but it was more than that. It felt as though something deep inside them was being washed away. The weight of their past, the fear of their future, the burdens they had carried for so long, all of it seemed to flow away with the water. Peter, who had always been so impulsive, so quick to act and speak, felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched the water flow through his fingers. For so long he had carried the guilt of his denial. Even though Jesus had forgiven him, he had not forgiven himself. But now, as the cool water touched his skin, he felt something shift inside him. The past was gone, washed away by the river of grace. He could not change what had happened, but he could choose to live in the present, where forgiveness and love were waiting for him. John too felt the weight of his pride lifting. He had always wanted to be close to Jesus, but now he realized that closeness wasn't about ambition or position, it was about humility and love. The present moment was all that mattered, and in this moment he was loved by the one who knew him better than he knew himself. And Thomas, who had always struggled with doubt, felt a peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, yes, but that uncertainty no longer frightened him. He didn't need to know what would happen. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was to trust the one who held the future in his hands. In this moment, Thomas felt his faith strengthen, not because he had all the proof, but because he had found peace in the present. Jesus knelt beside his disciples, his hands also dipping into the water. He looked at each of them with love in his eyes, his voice soft but filled with the power of truth. The past is like water that has already flowed. The future is a river that has yet to be seen. But here and now, in this moment, the water touches you. This is where you can choose love, forgiveness, and peace. Trust the flow of time, for God's grace is in every moment, past, present, and future. But His love can only be felt when you live fully in the present. Tears flowed freely from the eyes of the disciples. It was not sadness that filled them, but an overwhelming sense of peace and gratitude. They had carried their burdens for so long, too long. But here, in this moment, by the river, they had found freedom. As they rose from the riverbank and followed Jesus back along the path, their hearts were lighter, their steps more certain. They had learned that time flows in many directions, but life, true, abundant life, can only be lived in the present. They walked forward, filled with hope, knowing that the past could no longer hold them, and the future no longer frighten them. In the flowing river, they had found not just wisdom, but peace, grace, and the love of the one who walked beside them always. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.